Well, thank you very much, David, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak to this group. I've been anticipating this audience for quite a while because, of course, as David mentioned in the bio, I do have a long association, I guess, with the University of Calgary. I was a student there, a graduate student. I was a sessional instructor, and currently I serve on the Board of Governors of the U of C. So I have seen that university over the last 25 years from almost every angle, and I'm always delighted to be part of what we're doing at the University of Calgary. So thank you for making some time of your busy day and your schedules to come to this lunch, and again, thank you for inviting me to speak. The title of my presentation, as you can read, Have We Reached the Bottom Yet? Now, this is the number one question I'm getting as I travel around the province and indeed around the country. People are very curious. They want to know, how bad is it going to get in Alberta? Have we reached a tipping point? Are things going to improve next year, or are we set for another year of contraction? Where are we in the cycle, and have we reached the bottom? Well, by the end of the presentation, I hope to offer an answer to that question, but suffice it to say, I will answer it in a way only an economist could, and that is to say, it's a bit complicated. So we'll get to that answer by the end of the presentation. Now, probably like a lot of you, I grew up in the television age. And for people in the room under the age of 30, let me explain this diagram. This is what we used to call a television. Now, it looks a bit archaic, but it was probably a lot like a television I would have watched growing up as a kid in Edmonton in the 70s and 80s. And they told my generation, you watch way too much TV. You're doomed as a generation. All you do is sit there and watch TV. You're never going to be able to get a job, or you're never going to be able to communicate or get a date, and you're doomed. Well, I probably did watch a little bit too much TV, but generally speaking, our generation made it through okay. What I want to do this afternoon is talk about what's taking place in the global economy, what's taking place in the broader US and Canadian economies, and then focus it in on what's happening here in Alberta. And as I talk about each of those situations or economic events, I want to reference some of the great television shows over the last 50 years. Now, there is a bit of a generational issue here. Not for everyone will you know the shows. You might not remember them, or you might not be current enough watching them. But if you don't know the show, don't worry too much. I'll explain what the show's about and why, in fact, there are some interesting and maybe some playful little comparisons between those TV shows and what's taking place in the economy. So let's start first of all then with talking about about the European Union. Well, as we know, it's always a wild ride in Europe. There's always some big dramatic thing going on. And if the Europeans are good at anything, and they are good at many things, by the way, but they're really good at drama. There's always some wild thing, political crisis or economic or financial brink, just waiting to explode at any given moment. The TV show that reminds me of the European Union, the Muppet Show. You remember this show? If you don't remember it, this was a great TV show in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was all around Kermit the Frog, and there were all these crazy Muppet puppet characters, all of them lovable and charming in their own way, a few of them quite incompetent, and a couple of them had a hard time getting along well with the others. You might remember Miss Piggy and her karate chopping people. She actually wasn't very nice. But the European Union in 2016, it's a bit like the Muppet Show. There's all these member countries, all of them lovable and charming places. A few of them have been quite incompetent in the way they've managed their fiscal resources. And some of them are having a hard time getting along well with the others. But like the Muppet Show, I think the European Union is demonstrating it has an ability to kind of bumble its way through these things without actually disintegrating or falling apart. It's not to say that their economy is doing well. In fact, those southern Mediterranean nations like Greece and Spain and Italy, the ones that were really in the news a few years ago, we all remember the whole Greece drama and the Grexit, and is Spain going to default, and what's going to happen? You know, that has kind of subsided a bit, but their economies are still really, really struggling. Northern Europe doing a bit better, but I think Europe is it's bumbling its way through, but it is sort of a chronic underperformer economically, and I think we'll see that again in 2017. But we do need to talk about one of the rogue members of the Muppet Show, and that is, of course, the United Kingdom. which we remember back in June, back already, I guess, about 6 or 7 months ago, voted itself off the show with the Brexit vote, surprising everybody in the world, and maybe themselves most of all, with a slim majority voting in favor of leaving the European Union. Well, the TV show that first of all came to my mind, the Gong Show, but I actually don't think that's quite right. If you remember the Gong Show, it was sort of a spoof game show. It was a comedy. And I don't think this is quite the right comparison because, in fact, what's going on in the UK right now, I don't think anyone would suggest is very funny. There's a lot more at stake. Instead of the Gong Show, rather, I would say the TV show is this one, Lost. Now, this was, if you don't know this show, this was a very popular show about 10 years ago. It was about a group of people on an island, and they didn't know where they were going or what was going to happen next. There was a lot of confusion and a lot of mystery around the show. And even, in fact, for the audience watching Lost, no one knew what this show was about. Everyone was always just confused, like, what is going on? Well, the United Kingdom, in the latter half of 2016, in the post-Brexit environment, is surrounded by a lot of confusion and a lot of uncertainty. And as you can appreciate, if there's one thing businesses and investors do not like, it is uncertainty. It's not knowing exactly what is going to be the regulatory lay of the land a year or 2 years from now. What is going to be the United Kingdom's trade relationship with the rest of the European Union, or with the rest of the global economy for that matter. So there's a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty, and this is holding back the UK's economy. And I think it will until they get this all sorted out. Now, the most dire predictions of some of those economists, some of them warning that, oh, if this Brexit vote goes through, the UK is going to spiral into a recession. Actually, it turns out it hasn't. The United Kingdom, in fact, is a larger and more sophisticated economy than that, but growth has been basically stagnant. In other words, everything's just kind of in a holding pattern, waiting until there is resolution on what the trade and investment relationship is going to look like. And it's too bad in some ways that this happened, because prior to the Brexit vote, the United Kingdom, along with the United States, these were really the only two kind of bright spots in the global economy, at least among sort of the larger developed economies. They were growing. The UK's unemployment rate had fallen to the lowest in 12 years. Everything was kind of moving in the right direction, which could have in fact emboldened some of those British voters to vote for the Brexit. Maybe they felt confident enough in their own economy that they felt emboldened to vote for Brexit or to leave the European Union. Whatever their reasons, we do now see this path towards the UK exiting the European Union, and it will be an interesting couple of years while that gets sorted out. All right, let's turn across the other pond and talk about the world's second largest economy, and that is China. Well, the TV show that reminds me of China's economy in 2016, Fantasy Island. You remember this show? If you don't remember Fantasy Island, the young people in the room might think, was this a reality show of some sort? It wasn't. It was a scripted drama, but it was a popular show in the 1980s. And it was all revolved around this island, and every week some guests got to go to Fantasy Island, and they had the chance to live out some sort of wish or fantasy. And they usually found out that what they wished for wasn't quite what they expected. But in the show, it was always surrounded by this sense of what you're seeing here is not real, that this is all a bit of a mirage. None of this is true. In China's economy, at least when we look at those official indicators that come from the Chinese government, we have to have a bit of healthy skepticism in understanding what you're hearing and what we're seeing from those indicators is maybe not a true representation of what precisely is happening in China. It is all a little bit of a mirage. Now, we do know that China's economy over the last decade has really slowed down, moderated. A decade ago, it was growing at 10 or 11 or 12% GDP a year. And now it's probably closer to around 5 or 6%. We're not precisely sure. I'm actually not too concerned about the moderation in growth. I actually would be more concerned if the world's second largest economy kept growing at 12% a year. I don't think that's healthy or sustainable. So I'm not so concerned that growth in China has moderated. But you might remember almost a year ago now, back at the very beginning of 2016 in January, there was some wild market volatility coming out of Shanghai. very spooky kinds of movements, and in fact the Chinese government devaluing the currency. There were some strong suggestions that 2016 was going to be a very, very bumpy ride for China and the global economy. Turns out it didn't happen. And maybe a little bit like Europe, I think China has demonstrated an ability to kind of get past some of these stumbles along the way and smooth things out. I don't want to suggest that everything in China's economy is in good balance. There are clearly some imbalances, and that could still pose some problems in 2017 or beyond. But 2017, at this point, I think we can anticipate sort of more of the same. Some moderate growth in China, maybe with a few hiccups along the way. And that broadly will be supportive of global commodity prices, which of course is important for a country like Canada. All right, let's turn now to the United States, our neighbors to the south, where there's always interesting things going on. Now you may, if you were paying attention, about a month ago there was a vote in the United States. If you weren't paying any attention, there was a general election, and now everything changes in the United States. The political landscape, of course, moving in a very different direction than what I think a lot of people anticipated. But setting the politics of the United States aside, the US economy actually has been enjoying a pretty good year. When you look at those top line indicators, things like the unemployment rate, which is now at 4.6%, when you look at things like housing starts and manufacturing data and things around consumer spending, all of those indicators are showing generally good strength. And as a result, the US Federal Reserve is now set to raise interest rates for the first time this year, following the last time, which was last December, where it raised rates. Now, the markets have anticipated this for quite some time, and if we don't see a rate increase next week, it is going to be pretty, or is it this week? Coming up right away. It's going to be pretty dramatic news because the market has now built into its pricing of the US dollar that the US Federal Reserve will raise interest rates. But if you peel back some of the layers of those top-line indicators, this is where you start to see a few more sort of dark clouds on the horizon in the United States. Yeah, the unemployment rate, 4.6%. Yes, consumer spending has been growing. But if you just look at those average numbers, it really does mask a lot of imbalances and a lot of disparity of income and opportunity in the United States. Not every region of the country is enjoying 4.6% unemployment and rising wages. In fact, there are huge swaths of rural America particularly that is suffering chronically high unemployment and depressed economic opportunities. And it is this disparity in income and opportunity, which by the way exists here in Canada and Europe and everywhere else, but that gap between the people who have opportunities and those that do not has widened so much. Not only did we see this sort of manifest itself in the US political election, but it's starting to now have a broader economic impact as well. And I do think over the next 10 years that this is going to be the most serious challenge for the US economy, is addressing this gap between those with opportunities and those without. All right, let's turn now to the Canadian economy. I've got to keep moving along here. The Canadian economy, generally speaking, has been picking up a bit of momentum, at least in the second half of 2016. But the TV show that I want to reference to Canada, Gilligan's Island, do you remember this show? You got to go all the way back to the 60s to remember this one. Most of us remember this show in reruns. But if you don't remember the show, the premise was pretty simple. There were these 7 castaway characters, and they were trapped or stuck on this deserted island, and they couldn't get off. And every episode revolved around their scheme to try to come up with some plan. And this time for sure it's going to work, and we're going to get off the island and we're going to get home. But right at the very end of it, something would happen that would mess up the plan. And it was usually Gilligan, to great comedic effect. You know, and he'd kind of foil everything up, and the skipper would hit him with his hat. Well, why is this like the Canadian economy? Well, over the last 8 quarters, basically, the Canadian economy has failed to achieve its goal of raising GDP growth rates. The third quarter of 2016, the one that we just sort of got numbers for most recently, actually we did see some pretty decent growth there. But economists will point out, well, a lot of that was just sort of the echo effect, rebuilding from Fort McMurray and the energy sector coming back online. If you strip out the effect of that, the rest of the Canadian economy is still pretty weak. And the 7 quarters before that, we've seen chronic weakness in the Canadian economy. It is what, in the words of Governor Polas of the Bank of Canada, serial disappointment. In other words, quarter after quarter, those GDP numbers come out, and we fail to achieve the goal of getting growth up high enough to get the national unemployment rate down and to get more jobs created. Nationally, and this is, we'll talk about Alberta in a moment, but nationally, 6.8% unemployment, and actually it was 7% for most of the year. That's still too high. And we failed to really achieve growth rates strong enough to get those unemployment rates lower. However, even though we have been a bit chronically disappointing in our growth rates, like the characters on Gilligan's Island, we have to recognize that we actually have an amazingly good standard of life in this country, standard of living. The characters on Gilligan's Island, if you remember them, they enjoyed a very high quality of life. So high, it made you wonder, why do you want to get off this island? This looks like it would be great fun. You remember the movie stars? She always had some new dress on somehow. They always had lots of food to eat, and we're doing little songs and dances and making radios out of coconuts, and it was like a little utopia. Now, the Canadian economy and Canada as a country, I don't want to suggest we don't have any problems, because we have some serious problems in this country. But when I look around the rest of the world in 2016, the other day I was driving home to Calgary and I was listening to the CBC World Report at 6 o'clock. Wow, what a lot of really depressing, frightening news coming from the Middle East, and this was in the lead up to the US election, and a lot of anger, and all around the world it seemed to be nothing but very, very sad stories. And then as I got closer to Calgary, I tuned into the local news. This is what Calgary City Hall was arguing about that day. It was probably back in October. The main topic was, should we add fluoride back to the drinking water? Are there enough parking spots at the C train stops? And I don't want to minimize these, because it's important that we get those things right. It really is. But I couldn't help but think, wouldn't the people of Syria love to be arguing about fluoridation right now, rather than other far more serious and tragic issues that they have to contend with? So we do have issues in this country for sure. We have issues around homelessness. We have issues around substance abuse and addictions. We have issues that we've never properly resolved with our Indigenous peoples. I don't want to minimize any of that, but I would suggest that despite our underperformance in our GDP growth rates, Canada has afforded a quality of living that is the envy of the world. And maybe even more so after the US federal election. Canada is really being looked at for some leadership right now because of the quality of life and the celebration of diversity that we offer. So we can't lose sight of that and get too focused on that weak GDP growth rate. Pardon me. All right, let's move now and talk about Alberta, because you'd probably all agree that of the Canadian provinces, Alberta and our economic situation is probably the most compelling to watch right now. We have gone in a very short period of time, about 18 months, from the growth leader in the country to the laggard, from the lowest unemployment rate in the country to among the highest, and Calgary certainly the highest unemployment rate of any major Canadian city, in a remarkably short period of time. Well, we all know sort of how this happened. It was all due to energy prices, and the single economic factor that has changed is that drop in WTI, the reference benchmark price, from $107 a barrel in June of 2014, landing with a thud below $30 at the beginning of 2016, and now having modestly rebounded. Pardon me. Talk amongst yourselves. It's so dry in the city right now. My hands are chapped. I have no voice. We're all dealing with this. And now oil prices having modestly rebounded to around that $50 mark. Well, the TV show I want to use in reference to Alberta, is it going to come up here? It might not come up. Maybe Karen can hit advance. I don't know why this isn't working all of a sudden. It may have stalled. There we go. The TV show I want to use to reference Alberta, Downton Abbey. Now, by a show of hands, how many people are fans of Downton Abbey? A few brave souls. I love Downton Abbey. Now, either you're a fan of this show or you are not, or maybe you've never heard of it and never watched it. Let me give you the little rundown. It's a British show. It runs on PBS here in North America, and it's now finished its 6 seasons. But it was all around this fictional family set in England between the years 1912 and 1925. And it was set during this very dramatic period of change in British society. And for a lot of the characters on the show, some of them were very, very unhappy about these new changes. They were watching new innovations come about. They were watching things like women being allowed to have an opinion about something or to be able to hold a job or public office. They were watching some of the social structures or the social strata in British society kind of break down a little bit. And it left a lot of characters on the show very uncertain about where they belong in this world. But there were other characters on the show who were very energized by this whole brave new world that Britain was entering into, where in fact women could have an opinion or a job. So there were two sets of characters on the shows, ones that were very frightened and anxious by everything, and another set that was very energized and excited. And I think in Alberta, this is a lot what we're seeing right now. We are still seeing remnants of a sector that is, desperate to get oil back to $80 a barrel. They really liked it there. They knew how to make money there. They liked that world. It worked well for them. Everything was as the universe should be, and we want that world back. But there's another group that is saying, you know what, $80 oil probably isn't going to come back for a long, long time, maybe ever. But this actually raises all kinds of new, exciting possibilities for sectors outside of the petroleum industry. Sectors around clean technology, sectors around agriculture and forestry and tourism, sectors that often compete against the energy sector in attracting talent and resources. So there are these two groups of people, but I think there is a growing recognition that the world is moving on and Alberta has to adapt to those changing environments. Just a little bit on energy prices, where we think they're going. Well, we have to recognize, first of all, anything could happen with oil prices. A year from now, oil could be at $20 a barrel. It could be at $80 a barrel. I think either of those extremes is quite unlikely at this point. From the way our analysis kind of suggests is that we're going to see these prices remain kind of in that $45 to $55 range. OPEC does not even become the most significant factor anymore. OPEC was what, of course, drove those prices down to $30. And now OPEC is realizing, yeah, that's actually not working out so great for us. So they've agreed to some production limits, and that's pushed price back up. But I think the biggest factor moving forward, the factor that is going to keep kind of a ceiling on those prices at around 50 or 55 is the U.S. shale production. And that doesn't change. OPEC leaders come and go, and characters like Mr. Putin, who knows what they're going to say on any given day or when these agreements might break down. There's a lot of instability in that. But the U.S. shale productions, that technology doesn't go away. And when those price signals are strong enough, pretty close to where they're at now, that shale production comes back and acts as kind of keeping a ceiling on those prices. So I would suggest that we can anticipate oil prices, continental oil prices, that WTI price to remain in that $50 or $55 price range. Now this is good news and bad news for Alberta. The good news is $50 oil is almost twice as good as $27 oil, which is the lowest it got to. So that's good news. The bad news is, still for a lot of producers in the province, $50 oil is still a pretty challenging price. It's taken 2 years for a lot of companies to get their costs down. A lot of that, of course, has come on the shoulders of labor and layoffs. The industry now employs about 29 fewer people. 29%, yeah, only 29 people. 29% less people or fewer people than what we saw 2 years ago. So they've been working hard to get their efficiencies up and getting their costs down, largely payroll costs. And that is, I think, bringing some stability to the sector with prices back around $50 or $55. But it doesn't bring back growth yet to the industry. Yeah, we might start to hear about some companies maybe opening up their wallets a bit and some reinvestment happening in 2017. But I don't think we're going to see a lot of mass hiring taking place, not for a while. I think stable will be the new word to describe the energy sector. But stable is definitely better than 2 years of contraction. I want to talk about, oh yeah, that was my TV show for the energy sector, The Price is Right. Sorry. I want to talk briefly about the construction industry in Alberta, both the residential and the non-residential construction, because there is a lot of worry and anxiety, of course, maybe in this city particularly, about what now? Have we built far too many office buildings? We've got 30% vacancy in these downtown offices. Where is this going to leave us? Is this a catastrophe? Well, the TV show I want to use in reference to that, The Walking Dead. Now, some of you will know this show. They tell me this is the most watched TV show on the planet at the moment. It's a show about a post-apocalyptic world, a group of humans that have somehow avoided being infected by a virus. And the virus has turned everybody else in the world into zombies, and the zombies want to eat the human beings. That's basically the show. It's a very dark show, by the way. But in my metaphor, the construction companies, the home builders, the developers, they're not the zombies. They're actually the human beings that are surviving this. Construction companies have been through recessions many times before. And what we're seeing right now in Alberta is perhaps a nastier one than normal, but it's actually not that unusual. The home builders know how to respond to these kinds of downturns. Where we're seeing home starts, new housing starts, it's down about 30% from where we were 2 years ago. But we're still actually about levels even with the year of 2011. In other words, a 30% contraction or pullback, but that's coming from a record-setting year in 2014. So we've definitely seen a pullback in new housing starts, not to zero, from about 41,000 to about 25,000. But that pullback in new home construction is really helpful in helping to balance the residential market and particularly price. And the large commercial office developers and those leaseholders, they're not happy about this by any stretch, but they also know how to get through this, and I think they'll come through in good shape. Now, if you watch the show The Walking Dead, you'll know that the humans survive, but not everyone makes it out of every episode. Every now and then, one of the zombies does grab someone and tears them to shreds. And I think we will see some casualties in 2016, 2017, perhaps in the construction industry, in the home builders industry. But I think by and large, they'll make it through in decent shape. So just to wrap up, have we reached the bottom? This is where I'll give my somewhat complicated answer. It's sort of two parts. I think in the petroleum sector, we have reached the bottom, at least in terms of energy prices. I don't want to suggest that it's easy street from here on in, but I don't think that WTI price will test the lows that we saw earlier this year. I think we can anticipate some relative stability in price around that $45 to $55 range, and that will stabilize the industry next year. But in the labor market in Alberta, I don't think we have quite reached the bottom yet. And this is a message I don't like to give. It's part of the presentation that I don't like talking about, because it is always around the labor market where people become very emotional and there's a lot of worry and anxiety. No one lies awake at night worrying about wholesale trade report coming down the next day. While economists might do that, but generally speaking, people are anxious about their job situation. Am I going to have a job next week? Are my kids coming out of university going to have jobs? Are my neighbors, are they going to have to move because they're out of work? All the anxiety and negativity in the province right now is around the job market, and here we have seen the unemployment rate quite high, 10.3% in this city. I think we can anticipate that into early 2017, the job market is probably going to deteriorate a bit more, in fact, before it stabilizes and starts to come down toward the end of 2017, but I don't think we're quite over the hump yet. I think we can expect probably tougher conditions in the months ahead. Oil prices, I sort of mentioned that, should stabilize, perhaps rise modestly in 2017. Probably, I put this presentation together back when oil was at about 45 or 46, and now we're seeing prices above 50, and I think that's kind of where they'll trend, always with some volatility, but I think we've kind of reached a new a normal for prices. Other sectors are carrying the load of growth. So here's where I like to mention Alberta's second, third, and fourth largest base industries, and those are agriculture, forestry, and tourism. And they're all actually enjoying pretty good time of it right now. The forestry sector, there are some dark clouds on the horizon. We don't have a trade agreement in place, a softwood lumber trade agreement with the United States. That is going to be a very interesting negotiation to watch in 2017, and it could mean some trouble or some challenge for our forestry sector. But agriculture, agri-food producers in Alberta, 3 times as large as what it was 25 years ago in terms of value of production. And now, in fact, it's larger than refined petroleum when you look at it as a manufacturing sector. So our food processors are small, largely small and niche players doing very well, and I think lots of opportunity in 2017. And then tourism, probably looking at a 3rd consecutive record-breaking year in 2017, especially with the Canadian dollar remaining low, with our new YYC International Airport and some of those direct flights from China, and all kinds of opportunities and press that we've been given, including the cover of National Geographic last month, which mentions Banff, Alberta as one of the top 20 destinations in the world in which to visit in 2017. So I think there's lots of scope for tourism, seeing another record year in 2017, and that will be really helpful in helping to diversify Alberta's economy. Agriculture, forestry, tourism, even taken as a group, is dwarfed by the energy sector. I mean, it's not even close. So we have to understand that there is only so much growth that's going to come out of those sectors that will help balance things. But still, any growth that we can see in non-energy sectors will be very helpful. The retail, the housing market, those consumer-driven sectors, I think we will see maybe some surprising stability in 2017 as mood starts to lift with oil prices being a little bit higher, and maybe particularly in the second half of 2017 when we expect that unemployment rate to start gradually coming down. All of that will help lift mood, and mood and sentiment for things like the retail sector, the housing sector, are very, very important. The outlook for next year, we do a quarterly outlook, and our last one came out November 2nd. Our outlook at that point was calling for a real GDP growth in Alberta next year of 2.1%. Now that is a pretty modest growth rate, especially considering between 2010 and 2014, this province was averaging above 4% growth rate every year. So that all came to an end. 2015, 2016, 2 consecutive years of contraction. In total, probably about a 6% contraction over those 2 years. But now we are expecting growth, modest growth, to return in 2017, 2%. But emphasis really on the word modest. With that unemployment rate remaining elevated, it is still going to feel kind of like a recession year for a lot of job seekers. And it probably will result in people still being discouraged. We'll probably see a bit more out-migration from Alberta to other provinces. And all of that, I think, will take a little bit of a toll on the mood in the province. But I do think that 2017 will return to some growth and that we're moving into a period of recovery very gradually. So with that, I will conclude. I do want to let you know quickly about The Owl. This is our daily publication. I write it along with my other economist up in Edmonton, Nick. He and I take turns. We used to call it the Daily Economic Comment. Until they decided one day that is a really dull name for anything. Who would possibly sign up for something that dull? I probably would have, but most of the rest of the world wouldn't. So we rebranded it. We call it The Owl, in reference to our provincial bird. The great horned owl is Alberta's provincial bird. And if you know anything about owls, you would know they are very aware of what's going on around them. Nothing gets past an owl. So it's called The Owl. The subtitle is focused on Alberta's economy. It's a quick comment, a 60-second read every morning, always on some new indicator that's kind of hot off the press, and always in reference to Alberta. So we think it provides a very good real-time read with what's going on in Alberta's economy, and it'll be interesting to watch in 2017 as we move into a period of recovery. Perch is another publication that we produce. It comes out occasionally. It takes a deeper dive, look at some specific issues in Alberta's economy. And those you can get at atb.com/economics, and they are entirely free. So if you're interested in that, I invite you to check that out. My website and Twitter handle for the social media users. But with that, I would like to now turn it over to you if you have any questions, or even better yet, if you have comments or other observations from maybe your perspectives some of them maybe within the industry, within the energy sector. I would very much value those.
Thanks, Todd. Great presentation. My name is Steve O'Reilly. I'm with TriView Capital. The burning question at the table, I think, is what show was related to the U.S.?
There's always some observant people in the room. Well, truth be known, I took it out. And I took it out after the election because it didn't make sense anymore, and I didn't want it to be confused with a message I didn't intend. But I will tell you what the show was. The show was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But it wasn't in reference to the politics going on in the United States. It was in reference, and I mentioned it, you know, the US has some deeper problems. And I was making the reference that it has some vampires to slay, and that is the disparity of income and opportunity in the United States. But after the election, it just felt weird to have anything related to vampires, you know, talking about the US economy. So I just took it out. But thank you for observing that and noting it. Oh, well, maybe that might be the show. Over here, yeah.
Thanks, Todd. It's Greg Zinter with Pure HM. When you did your little forecast here, did you factor in carbon levy at all?
Any other questions from the audience?
Good one.
Well, there's always a question about the carbon levy. No, and the way I'll answer that, I mean, there's huge political implications around the carbon tax, and I can't comment on that at all. I'm not a political analyst. As an economist, though, we can look at a carbon levy or a carbon fee, and different economists will have different opinions on it. We don't factor it into our model specifically because the way this carbon levy is set up, it's a redistribution of money and spending, not a withdrawal. Now, that doesn't mean, for example, that it's not going to impact individual families or households. It will. But from the macro economic model for Alberta, we consider it's basically a wash. So I don't minimize that, but we don't factor that into our model.
Hey, Bob Bott here. You compared different unemployment rates, and I'm just wondering about the participation rates. They make quite a difference because I believe we had quite the highest participation rate. So when you have an unemployment rate, it's a percentage of participation. And when people compare Canada and the US, again, participation rate skews that.
Yeah, and we do have it's a really good observation. We have a high participation rate in Alberta, mostly because of our demographics. We have a much younger demographic compared to other Canadian provinces or compared to the United States. So as a result, that participation rate, because we have more people in that 25 to 45-year-old cohort, not very many people choose to retire in Alberta. They all go to BC or somewhere warmer. So as a result, we have a high participation rate. The question maybe about, is there some masking going on with the unemployment rate in Alberta at 9%? I would suggest that 9% unemployment rate does sort of mask underemployment, or it masks people, it doesn't count people who are working only part-time or maybe a contract work or some bits and pieces of work that they can scrap together. They'd still be considered employed, but they're underemployed. So that 9%, I think, doesn't give quite the right impression. Probably if you count it, in the US, the way their Bureau of Labor counts it, there is a measure of underemployment. But in Alberta, I would suggest that our unemployment and underemployment rate is much higher than 9%.
Awesome talk, thank you. It's Maggie Hanna here, and Todd, I'd like to look a little farther into the future and get your take on the energy transition we're just at the beginning of. Mm-hmm. And if it was only 2% oversupply, took us from $100 a barrel to about 30, then when we put electric cars and transport trucks on the road, and when we put batteries in place that can handle electricity from renewables, the vanadium flow batteries, for example, then then what is going to happen to the oil price, to the oil companies? Are they going to move into being more energy companies or not? I'm just wondering
Yeah.
a little farther in the future. Thanks.
Another fantastic question, and I think it's a question that would be on a lot of people's minds in this province right now, if they want to admit it or not. The question sort of looms over us as a province. Is this all we've got? Is hydrocarbons? Is there nothing else? And I think most forward-looking Albertans would say, well, no, we've got a lot of other things. Most of these energy companies in the 10 square blocks around us would say that, no, we're about more than just hydrocarbons, we're energy producers. And as a province, Alberta, one of our strengths is around producing energy. I think that there, for a long time, will be a space in that energy folder for hydrocarbons, but I think we also need to think about how do we add to hydrocarbons, not turn away from it, but how do we add to hydrocarbons other sources of energy, renewable sources of energy. And it always frustrates me, oftentimes in this city, when you bring up, renewable energy, sometimes people will recoil a little bit, believing that you are anti-hydrocarbons simply because you talk about renewable energy. And I think we can be both. I think the world will have an appetite for hydrocarbons for a long time, even though that may decline gradually, into the longer term future. But we need to prepare ourselves for that as well. I think Alberta has lots of opportunity. David and I were talking a little bit earlier. I think there's lots of scope and opportunity for developing technologies in the geothermal space. I think that's a natural springboard for Alberta and our engineering and our geological expertise that we have in this province already. And lots of other forms of renewable energies and clean technologies too.
Hi, Todd. Evan Baker. Sort of along, continuing on from that theme, now that the Alberta government has started to announce some programs to go along with their policies of converting to a larger percentage of renewable energy, do you see that being much of an economic driver into 2017, some of the programs and money that they're starting to put on the table?
Well, I can't speak specifically about the programs of the province. I'm not all that familiar with a lot of them. I mean, I have sort of a base understanding of them. So I don't want to comment on those programs, those provincial government programs specifically. But I think, again, we're at a place in Alberta right now where programs or not, industries are looking for new opportunities. If some of those programs can nudge them in the right direction, I guess that's great. But one of the things that the private sector is great at doing is finding those opportunities. And right now, Alberta is very fertile ground for a lot of opportunities. You might not have said that 3 years ago when you couldn't hire people or find office space, or the cost of doing business in this province was expensive. But now those conditions have completely reversed. So government programs, they'll do certain things, but I think the bigger driver here is really the entrepreneurial attitudes and the right business conditions.
Hello, Anita Arduini from Portfire Associates. I have a question about petrochemical diversification in Alberta, and we saw the announcements this week or last week about the $500 million royalty credit. So my question to you is, a lot of the oil and gas players in Alberta, multinationals that also do a lot of petrochemical activities around the world, not necessarily here. What would you say would be a way to encourage more petrochemical activity here in Alberta by those organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And for governments in this province for a long time, not just this one, but for the last 40 years, finding ways to diversify our manufacturing, finding ways to stimulate new industries like petrochemicals and those kinds of manufacturing activities. This has sort of, been on the top list of priorities for governments for a long time. Tax credits and certain programs like this, I think, can be helpful. But I think in the longer term, what industries are going to look for is this a stable economy? Do we have transportation routes so we can move these commodities around the world? Do we have modern transportation to ports? The pipelines of our hydrocarbons is one thing. But what other kinds of facilities do we have to move these commodities about? And also, what kind of quality of life do we have here? They have to hire people. And if it's a quality of life where it's difficult to bring people to that city or that region, that matters for companies too. So yeah, tax credits will go some ways in incenting that behavior, but I think there's a lot of other things that companies look for too, including quality of life.
Todd, thanks again for a great chat. I actually have a question because it popped into my mind that for the last 3 days, I've heard nothing else and people asking me what I think about the latest Fraser report, where the attractiveness of Alberta has dropped, I think 1.5 spots, whereas Saskatchewan beside us is number 4, and Oklahoma and Texas are 1 and 2 for hydrocarbon investment from a world perspective. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, I haven't seen the report, so I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I haven't seen it, so I can't really comment on it because I don't really know all the criteria that they've looked at, so I can't comment about that specifically.
Fair enough. Well, on that point, I pulled rank and asked that one. I want to thank you for your time, Todd. If we could all join in thanking Todd for his time.
Thank you very much.